I create dark, extreme horror stories, and for just $1, you can help me keep the horror alive. It's like buying me a terrifying cup of coffee to fuel the next gruesome tale. If you'd like to support, please consider donating. My PayPal link is in the description. Due to YouTube guidelines, it's difficult to create R-rated content, so I kindly request you to join me on Patreon for just $1. It was supposed to be just a getaway, a wild weekend at the infamous Crystal Lake campgrounds. The old place had been shuttered for years, after some tragic accident that none of them really cared to know about. Matt, the ringleader of the group, had found the place online, and the thrill of spending a weekend in an abandoned camp was too much for their reckless bunch to resist. So, 5 of them piled into an old beat-up van: Matt, his girlfriend Rachel, the laid-back jock Ryan, the always sarcastic Megan, and quiet but mysterious Jake. The road to Crystal Lake was twisted, lined with skeletal trees that looked like they belonged in some forgotten horror flick. As they drove deeper into the forest, the group joked about campfire tales and urban legends, oblivious to the creeping dread that seemed to cling to the air. Isn't this place supposed to be haunted or something? Rachel asked from the back, a cigarette dangling between her fingers. Yeah, haunted by boredom, Matt laughed, swerving the van around a sharp turn. But seriously, this place had some incident years back. Camp counselors went missing. It's all just local bullshit to keep the tourists away. Yeah, well, maybe they got bored to death, Megan quipped, her voice dripping with sarcasm. They arrived just before dusk, the campgrounds quiet and eerily still. A large wooden sign, faded from years of neglect, greeted them: Crystal Lake, closed for the season. Beyond it, the cabins sat in ruin, weathered by time and decay. Broken windows, rotting wood, and overgrown paths painted the picture of abandonment. But it was perfect for their weekend of debauchery. They unpacked quickly, throwing their bags into one of the least dilapidated cabins, and immediately cracked open beers, cranking up the music from a portable speaker. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the camp, but no one paid it any mind. They had come to party, and as the night fell, the group gathered around a fire, swapping half-hearted ghost stories and laughing at their own bravado. It was Ryan who suggested they play a game, a dare, really, to explore the campgrounds after midnight. Let's see who's got the guts to go to the old mess hall alone, Ryan challenged, leaning back with a cocky grin. That place looks like it's falling apart, Rachel said, rolling her eyes. Exactly. What's the matter? Scared of a little old cabin? Ryan teased, his grin widening. Megan snorted. I'll go, if you girls are too chicken, and so, the dare was set. Megan took the flashlight and set off toward the mess hall, the others staying behind by the fire. The night seemed to swallow her whole as she disappeared into the trees. Minutes passed. Then, an hour. Megan didn't return. She's probably just trying to scare us, Matt said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. I'll go check on her. He stood, grabbing another flashlight, and headed toward the mess hall. The wood seemed darker, denser than before. The further he walked, the quieter it became, like the night itself was holding its breath. When he reached the mess hall, the door hung open, creaking with the soft breeze. Megan, he called, stepping inside. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room, revealing overturned tables and broken chairs, but no sign of her. Just as he turned to leave, the sound of something dripping caught his ear. His flashlight flickered over to the far corner of the room, where a dark, wet stain spread across the floor. And there, slumped against the wall, was Megan, her throat slit wide open, her eyes staring lifelessly ahead, as blood continued to ooze from her gaping wound. Matt stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. Before he could scream, something cold and sharp pressed against the back of his neck. He froze, his heart pounding. The flashlight slipped from his hand as he felt the cold metal of scissors bite into his skin. With a quick, brutal motion, the unseen attacker snapped the blades shut, severing flesh and sinew in one vicious cut. Matt fell to the ground, choking on his own blood, his vision fading to black as his life ebbed away. Back at the campfire, the group grew restless. Rachel glanced at the trees, her brow furrowing. "Matt's taking too long. Yeah, this isn't funny anymore," Ryan added, standing up. "I'll go look for them." Jake remained silent, his eyes narrowed as he watched Ryan grab a flashlight and head in the same direction as the others, but Ryan never made it to the mess hall. Halfway there, something rustled in the bushes beside him. He stopped, the flashlight beam cutting through the dense foliage. "Matt? Megan? Is that you?" The only answer was the soft crunch of leaves behind him. Before Ryan could react, a shadow loomed over him, and cold, hard steel slid between his ribs. The pain was immediate and excruciating, as the masked figure twisted the scissors deeper, ripping through his flesh. Blood sprayed out, soaking the ground as Ryan collapsed, gasping for air. His killer stood over him, silent and relentless, before driving the blades into his chest again and again, until nothing but a lifeless, blood-soaked corpse remained, back at the campfire. Jake and Rachel sat in tense silence. The music still played, but the fun had drained from the night. "Something's wrong," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "They should have been back by now," Jake nodded, but said nothing. He had a feeling, an instinct, that something terrible had happened. He grabbed a knife from the campsite supplies and stood. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Rachel's eyes widened. "Jake, don't. We should all go." "Stay here," he repeated, more firmly this time. The dark woods, his grip tight on the knife. He followed the trail that led to the mess hall, every step weighed down by the oppressive silence of the forest. When he reached the clearing, he saw the mess hall's door hanging open, just as Matt had, but inside was a scene far worse than he'd imagined. Megan's body lay crumpled in the corner, her throat a gruesome slash of red. And next to her, sprawled in a pool of blood, was Matt, his neck almost severed by a brutal cut. Jake's stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. He turned to run, but before he could take a step, a figure stepped out from the shadows. The killer wore a mask, a grotesque visage of something long dead. And in his hand, he clutched a pair of blood-stained scissors. Jake backed away, raising the knife in defense, but it was futile. The killer lunged forward, the scissors glinting in the moonlight. They slashed across Jake's arm, tearing through muscle and bone. He screamed, but there was no one to hear him. In the final moments, as the killer brought the scissors down on him again and again, Jake realized the truth. There would be no escape. This place was a death trap, and they had all walked into it willingly. Back at the campsite, Rachel waited, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence was unbearable, each second dragging on like an eternity. When she finally heard footsteps approaching, relief washed over her. "Jake?" she called out, standing up, but it wasn't Jake who emerged from the woods, it was the killer. Before Rachel could scream, the masked figure was upon her, the scissors slicing through the air with deadly precision. Rachel froze, the crackling of the dying fire the only sound between them. The killer moved with an eerie calm, his masked face devoid of any humanity. In his hand, the scissors gleamed under the pale moonlight, rusted, jagged, and stained with frost, her survival instinct kicking in. She didn't wait for the monster to close the distance. She bolted toward the nearest cabin, her feet pounding against the ground as panic clawed at her chest. The door slammed behind her, and she quickly dragged an old, rotting chair in front of it. Her heart raced as she scanned the room for anything she could use to defend herself. The cabin was a shell of what it once was, broken furniture, shattered windows, and mildew-covered walls. There was no weapon, no phone, nothing that could save her. Her mind raced, replaying the last few hours. Matt, Megan, Ryan, Jake. They were all gone. She was alone. Alone with him, a shadow moved past the window. Rachel swallowed a scream, backing further into the corner of the room. She could hear his footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the hunt. The old wood creaked beneath his weight, each step growing closer to the door. Then, silence. For a moment it was as if the entire world had stopped. Suddenly, the door shook violently as the killer slammed his body against it. The fragile chair splintered on the first hit, and Rachel barely had time to react. She darted toward the back window, ripping at the rotten frame with trembling hands. The door crashed open behind her, and she felt a rush of air as the killer charged into the cabin. Rachel flung herself through the window. Shards of glass tearing at her skin. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting up her arm, but adrenaline pushed her to her feet. The killer was right behind her, the sound of his heavy breathing filling the night air as he followed her like a predator stalking its prey. She ran blindly through the woods, branches slapping against her face and arms. The trees blurred together as she stumbled through the undergrowth, her lungs burning with every breath. But the killer was relentless. She could hear him crashing through the forest behind her, each step closer caught on a root, sending her sprawling to the ground. She groaned in pain, her ankle throbbing as she tried to push herself back up. But before she could stand, a hand grabbed her by the hair, yanking her up with brutal force. She screamed, clawing at the masked killer's hand, but it was no use. He slammed her against a tree, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She gasped for air as he lifted the scissors, the blades glinting wickedly in the moonlight. "No, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, but the killer showed no mercy. With a swift motion, he drove the scissors into her shoulder, the jagged blades sinking deep into her flesh. Rachel screamed in agony as he twisted the blades, tearing through muscle and bone. Blood poured from the wound, staining her clothes and the ground beneath her. The pain was excruciating, every nerve in her body screaming for relief. But the killer wasn't done. He yanked the scissors free, leaving her to slump against the tree. For a moment, she thought it was over, that maybe, just maybe, he would leave her there to die, but then, he moved again. This time, he grabbed her arm, pinning it to the tree with one hand as he raised the scissors high above his head. Rachel's eyes widened in horror as she realized what he was about to do. "No. No," she shrieked, thrashing wildly. With a sickening crunch, the scissors came down, severing her arm at the elbow. Blood sprayed from the wound, painting the tree in a macabre display of violence. Rachel's screams echoed through the forest, but there was no one to hear her. The killer stepped back, his mask expressionless as he watched her writhe in agony. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling with shock and blood loss. She was dying, and they both knew it, but still, the killer wasn't done. He knelt beside her, his cold, emotionless eyes staring into hers as he raised the scissors one final time. From the pain, she barely felt the blades as they pierced her chest, puncturing her heart and silencing her screams forever. The campgrounds fell silent once again, the only sound a rustle of leaves in the wind. The killer stood, his body drenched in blood, the scissors still clutched in his hand. He looked down at Rachel's lifeless body for a moment before turning and disappearing into the woods, leaving behind only carnage and death in his wake. Hours passed. The sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, but the campgrounds remained shrouded in darkness. The bodies of Matt, Megan, Ryan, Jake, and Rachel lay scattered across the camp, their blood soaking into the earth. But there was one more left alive. Deep in the woods, Jake stirred. He had passed out after the killer had slashed his arm, leaving him for dead in the undergrowth. But somehow, he had survived. His body screamed in pain, every movement sending waves of agony through him, but he forced himself to his feet. His hand clutched at his bleeding arm, and he stumbled through the trees, every step a battle against his own body. He had to get out of here. He had to survive. The sun was beginning to rise when Jake finally reached the edge of the campgrounds. His vision swam, and his body felt like it was about to give out, but he kept moving. He stumbled onto the dirt road where their van was parked. The sight of it filling him with a brief surge of hope, but that hope was short-lived. Standing in front of the van, blocking his path, was the killer. His mask was splattered with blood, his clothes soaked in the evidence of his carnage. In his hand, the scissors gleamed, still wet with Rachel's blood. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized there was no escape. The killer wasn't going to let him leave. Not alive. With a snarl of defiance, Jake grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a rusted tire iron from the van, and charged at the got through his arm with every movement, but he didn't care. This was his only chance. The killer was fast, impossibly fast. He sidestepped Jake's swing and slashed at his chest with the scissors. Jake cried out as the blades tore through his skin, but he didn't stop. He swung again, this time connecting with the killer's shoulder, knocking him off balance. For a moment, Jake thought he had the upper hand. But then, the killer lunged forward, driving the scissors into his stomach. Jake gasped, his body going rigid as the blades twisted inside him, ripping through his organs with brutal efficiency. The tire iron slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground as he collapsed. The killer stood over him, pulling the scissors free in one fluid motion. Jake's vision blurred, his life slipping away with every ragged breath. As the darkness closed in around him, Jake's last thought was of his friends, their bodies scattered across the campgrounds, victims of the nightmare they had unknowingly walked into. The killer stepped over Jake's body, leaving him to bleed out on the dirt road as he disappeared back into the woods, a shadow among the trees. The camp was silent once more, the horror of the night fading into the rising sun. But the legend of Crystal Lake would live on, the blood-soaked grounds forever haunted by the memories of those who had fallen prey to the masked killer. And somewhere, deep in the forest, he waited, scissors in hand, for the next group of reckless souls to wander into his domain. The sun had just begun to crest over the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows over the blood-soaked camp. Jake's lifeless body lay in a pool of crimson, the faint light illuminating the horror etched into his face. Deep within the trees, the killer moved silently, as if he were one with the woods themselves. His scissors, caked with blood and gore, glinted with malicious intent as he prepared for the next. Far from the campsite, Emily staggered out of the dilapidated restroom building, her hands trembling as she clutched a broken shard of mirror. The others were gone. The realization hit her like a brick. She had watched in frozen terror as Matt was gutted like a fish, his innards spilling onto the dirt, steam rising from his body in the cold night air. Megan's desperate pleas for mercy still echoed in her ears, haunting her every step, but Emily refused to give up. She wasn't like the others. She would survive, she had to. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, trying to stay as silent as possible. Her ankle was twisted, swollen from when she'd fallen during her frantic escape. But there was no time for pain now. The killer was still out there. She could feel his presence like a shadow lingering over her shoulder. Suddenly, a sound. A soft creak from somewhere nearby. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. She gripped the shard of glass tighter, the edges digging into her skin until blood trickled down her fingers. She knew what was coming. The steady, deliberate footsteps drew closer, slow and methodical, each one a death knell. The door to the restroom building swung open with a groaning creak, the killer's silhouette filling the frame. His mask, cold, expressionless, seemed to absorb the dim light, making him appear as if he were carved from the shadows themselves. The scissors dangled at his side, glinting with a terrifying promise of pain, Emily swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could barely see through the fog of fear clouding her mind, but she knew she had to move. She couldn't stay here, cornered like an animal waiting to be slaughtered. The killer stepped inside, his heavy boots crunching over the broken tiles on the floor. Emily bit her lip, suppressing a whimper as he passed dangerously close to her hiding spot. He stopped for a moment, tilting his... Far from the campsite, Emily staggered out of the dilapidated restroom building, her hands trembling as she clutched a broken shard of mirror. The others were gone. The realization hit her like a brick. She had watched in frozen terror as Matt was gutted like a fish, his innards spilling onto the dirt, steam rising from his body in the cold night air. Megan's desperate pleas for mercy still echoed in her ears, haunting her every step, but Emily refused to give up. She wasn't like the others. She would survive, she had to. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, trying to stay as silent as possible. Her ankle was twisted, swollen from when she'd fallen during her frantic escape. But there was no time for pain now. The killer was still out there. She could feel his presence like a shadow lingering over her shoulder. Suddenly, a sound. A soft creak from somewhere nearby. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. She gripped the shard of glass tighter, the edges digging into her skin until blood trickled down her fingers. She knew what was coming. The steady, deliberate footsteps drew closer, slow and methodical, each one a death knell. The door to the restroom building swung open with a groaning creak, the killer's silhouette filling the frame. His mask, cold, expressionless, seemed to absorb the dim light, making him appear as if he were carved from the shadows themselves. The scissors dangled at his side, glinting with a terrifying promise of pain. Emily swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could barely see through the fog of fear clouding her mind, but she knew she... For a brief second, Emily thought she was safe, that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't noticed her crouching behind the rusted stall door. But then, in one swift motion, he lunged forward, swinging the scissors with terrifying precision. The blades sliced through the air, embedding themselves into the flimsy door just inches from Emily's face. She screamed, bolting out of her hiding place and rushing toward the exit, limping painfully as the killer yanked the scissors free and pursued her with relentless purpose. His heavy footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Emily burst out into the open air, her vision swimming with panic as she ran toward the only structure still standing, the old ranger station at the edge of the camp. She didn't dare look back. The sound of the killer's pursuit was enough to keep her legs moving. Despite the burning pain shooting up from her ankle, the station loomed ahead, its windows cracked and dark, a relic of the camp's forgotten history. Emily prayed it would provide some kind of refuge, though deep down she knew it was a futile hope. There was no safety here. Not from him. She stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind her and jamming a nearby chair beneath the handle. Her chest heaved with exertion, her lungs screaming for air as she scanned the small, decaying room for anything that could help her fight back. Her eyes landed on a dusty old shotgun mounted on the wall. She hobbled over, ripping it down with shaky hands. But her heart sank as she realized it was empty. No ammo, no salvation, a crashing sound from outside. The killer was near. Emily's mind raced, desperation clawing at her. If she couldn't fight him, she would have to outsmart him. The only way out was through a narrow window on the far side of the room. She limped toward it, wincing as her ankle protested. It opened just as the door behind her began to splinter under the killer's relentless assault. She hoisted herself through the window, her body screaming in pain as she tumbled onto the ground outside. But she didn't stop. She crawled, bloodied and broken, toward the tree line. Behind her, the door to the ranger station shattered, the killer stepping through the wreckage like a specter of death. He paused for a moment, surveying the room, before turning his gaze toward the open window. Emily glanced over her shoulder just in time to see him disappear from view. He was coming. She scrambled to her feet, pushing her body beyond its limits as she limped toward the dense woods. Her ankle gave way again, sending her crashing to the ground with a scream. But before she could pick herself up, she felt a heavy boot slam down on her back, pinning her to the dirt. The killer stood over her, his shadow casting a long, ominous figure as he raised the scissors high above his head. Emily struggled, clawing at the earth, but it was no use. She was trapped. With a swift, brutal motion, the killer brought the scissors down, the jagged blades sinking deep into her thigh. Emily screamed, her body convulsing in agony as the blood poured from the wound. The killer twisted the blades, wrenching them free with a sickening crunch before driving them into her again, this time pinning her arm to the ground. Her vision blurred, the world spinning as pain consumed her. She could feel the life draining from her, her strength ebbing away with each agonizing second. But still, the killer continued his gruesome work, his movements cold and mechanical as he methodically butchered her, reducing her body to a bloodied, mutilated mess. The last thing Emily saw before the darkness claimed her was the killer's mask. Those cold, empty eyes staring down at her, devoid of any trace of humans, were bathed in the eerie light of dawn, the once peaceful setting now transformed into a nightmare of blood and death. Bodies lay scattered across the clearing, their faces twisted in expressions of terror and pain. Blood soaked the earth, staining the ground with the remnants of the night's carnage, but the killer was gone. Like a shadow, he had disappeared into the woods, leaving behind only death and silence. Hours later, a search team arrived, responding to the frantic 911 call that had been placed by one of the campers earlier in the night. The officers moved cautiously through the camp, their faces pale as they took in the scene of horror before them. The leader of the group, Officer Grant, shook his head as he looked down at the remains of Emily's body. Jesus Christ, what the hell happened here? Looks like some kind of massacre, one of the younger officers replied, his voice trembling. Grant knelt beside the body, his expression grim. We need to find out who did this. And fast. But as they searched the camp, combing through the bloodied remains of the victims, one thing became clear: the killer had vanished without a trace, and somewhere, deep within the dark, shadowy woods, he waited, his scissors sharpened, his mask ready. The legend of the 13th Friday would live on, the blood of the innocent forever staining the ground. And as long as there were reckless souls to wander into his domain, the killing would never stop. The search team at the camp was pulling back in shock as the gravity of the scene hit them. The morning sun did nothing to erase the nightmarish reality that unfolded under its pale light. Blood still pooled beneath bodies torn apart by the vicious killer's rampage. Even the most hardened officers found themselves turning away from the sight of flesh twisted beyond recognition. Officer Grant stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the dark trees where the killer. He had seen his share of crime scenes, but nothing like this. His gut told him the killer wasn't far, that he was watching them, hidden somewhere in the shadows. As the team moved forward, more gruesome discoveries were made. In a twisted mockery of life, one victim had been left hanging by their feet from a tree, their torso flayed open, organs carefully arranged on the ground beneath like a grotesque offering. Another had been pinned to the ground with the killer's signature weapon, the scissors, jammed through their skull, the blade still protruding, glinting in the sunlight. We need to set up a perimeter, Grant barked at his team, snapping them out of their stunned silence. No one leaves until we find him. Meanwhile, in a secluded corner of the campgrounds, hidden beneath a pile of debris, someone was still alive. Rachel gasped for breath, her throat raw from suppressing her screams all night. She had been hiding since the moment she heard the first blood-curdling cry. From the shadows, she had seen the others die, seen the way the killer moved with a deliberate, almost sadistic pleasure as he hunted them one by one. She had watched in horror as his scissors found flesh, the jagged blades slicing effortlessly through muscle and bone. She had barely escaped his notice by diving under a collapsed section of the old cabins. Now, as the search team combed the area, she hesitated. If she emerged now, she would be safe. But what if he was still out there, watching her? What if he was waiting for her to make a sound, to reveal her hiding place? Her muscles ached from staying so still, her body covered in dirt and blood that wasn't her own. With every breath, she fought the urge to scream, to cry for help. She had seen what happened to the others who screamed. They didn't survive, but she had to move. She couldn't stay here forever. The killer, meanwhile, was far from finished. Deep in the forest, he stood untouched by time. It was here, in this decrepit building, that he had learned the art of death. The scissors in his hand were not just a weapon, they were a symbol of his wrath, his thirst for vengeance. The cold steel had once belonged to someone else, someone who had taught him how to cut not just flesh, but spirit. His hand clenched tighter around the handle, his breathing steady as he planned his next move. His mask, spattered with blood, reflected the years of torment he had suffered. This place, the camp, had been his prison once, long before the murders started. The memories still haunted him, fueling the darkness within. Every stab, every slice, every agonized scream was a release for him. A symphony of suffering that echoed the torment of his past, but he was not yet satisfied. The search team might have come, but they were nothing compared to the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of making his prey feel true fear. He sharpened the scissors slowly, methodically, savoring the anticipation. Rachel gathered every ounce of courage she had left and crawled out from under the wreckage. She moved silently, her eyes darting around, scanning for any sign of movement. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every snap of a twig made her flinch. She needed to find the officers, to tell them what she had seen, but the fear of the killer finding her first kept her paralyzed. As she crept through the camp, her foot brushed against something soft. She looked down and stifled a scream. It was Megan's severed arm, discarded like trash in the dirt. Blood stained the grass around it, and Rachel felt bile rise in her throat as she stumbled away. Suddenly, she heard voices. The officers. Relief washed over her as she rushed toward the sound, her limbs shaky but driven by survival instinct. Help. Over here. Rachel called out, her voice cracking. Officer Grant spun around, immediately drawing his weapon as Rachel burst from the trees across her face and arms. Jesus Christ, hold on. Are you hurt? Grant rushed forward, signaling his team to surround her and secure the area. He's still out there, Rachel panted, collapsing against the officer. He killed them all. He's going to kill me too. We're going to get you out of here, Grant said, but his voice lacked confidence. He knew the kind of killer they were dealing with. This wasn't over. The killer watched from a distance, his breathing slow and measured. Rachel had escaped him once, but it wouldn't happen again. He relished the idea of hunting her down, of watching her panic, her face twisted in terror as his scissors found their mark. He moved silently through the woods, circling the camp, waiting for the right moment. The officers were nothing to him, pawns in his game of blood and torment. They would be dealt with when the time was right. For now, his eyes were locked on Rachel. She was the one that got away, and he couldn't let that stand. The forest became his ally, the trees his cover as he crept closer, the scissors gleaming in his hand. The sun had risen, but the darkness inside him thrived. He knew every inch of these woods, every path, every hidden spot where he could strike. He was patient, methodical. Pain was not just his weapon, it was his art. Rachel and the officers reached the edge of the camp where the vehicles were parked. She thought she was safe, but something in the air felt wrong. A chill ran down her spine as they neared the cars. Suddenly, a sharp sound. A thud. Officer Grant's body jolted as the scissors pierced his neck from behind, blood spraying from the wound as his body collapsed to the ground in a gurgling heap. Chaos erupted. The remaining officers scrambled, shouting commands, but the killer moved with lethal precision. Another officer fell, his head split open as the killer plunged the scissors into his skull, the force driving the blades through bone with a sick scream, running toward the trees again as the remaining officers tried to fire their weapons, but the killer was too fast, darting between them with inhuman speed. One by one, they were taken down, their screams lost in the violence of the moment. Blood coated the ground, mixing with the dirt as Rachel ran, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest she thought it might explode. She could hear him behind her, the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the forest floor, getting closer with every second. She tripped, falling hard onto the ground, pain shooting up her legs. She scrambled to her feet, her vision blurry from tears and exhaustion. There was nowhere left to run. She was trapped. Suddenly, she saw it, a small hunting cabin at the edge of the woods. With no other option, she bolted toward it, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it with trembling hands. Inside, the cabin was dark and cramped, filled with old hunting gear and rotting furniture. Rachel grabbed a rusty hunting knife from a table, her hands slick with sweat and blood. She crouched in a corner, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She knew he was coming. Outside, the killer approached the cabin, his scissors still dripping with blood. He tilted his head, listening. He could hear her breathing, her heart racing. With one swift kick, the door splintered inward. The killer stepped inside. His mask, catching the dim light, filled the air as the cold steel of the scissors tore through her flesh. The pain was blinding, her body convulsing as the blades sliced deep into her side. Blood gushed from the wound, spilling across the cabin floor in dark, crimson pools. The killer stood over her, unmoved by her agony, his grip on the scissors tightening as he twisted them, eliciting another blood-curdling scream from Rachel, her vision blurred, the edges of her consciousness fraying as the pain overwhelmed her. Every nerve in her body was on fire, every breath a struggle. She felt the cold floor beneath her cheek, slick with her own blood, as the killer pulled the scissors free with a sickening squelch. She gasped for air, trying to crawl away, but her limbs refused to cooperate. The killer watched her struggle, a silent predator savoring the moment. He was in no rush. Torture was an art form to him, and Rachel was his canvas. He crouched beside her, his mask tilted slightly as if admiring his handiwork. The scissors, now dripping with her blood, glinted in the dim light of the cabin. He ran the tip of the blades lightly down her back, teasing her with the promise of more pain to come. Rachel's mind raced, desperate to survive, but the agony made it hard to think. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her body trembling uncontrollably. She knew she couldn't escape him, not like this. But she couldn't die here. Not like the others. The killer's hand gripped her hair, yanking her head back with a violent tug. She cried out, her scalp burning as he forced her to face him. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto his mask, the emotionless facade staring back at her. The killer raised the scissors again, this time aiming for her throat, but Rachel wasn't done fighting. With a surge of adrenaline, she twisted in his grip, slamming her knee into his groin. The killer staggered backward, much, but it was enough. Rachel grabbed the hunting knife she had dropped earlier and, with all the strength she had left, drove it into the killer's leg. A guttural sound escaped from behind the mask as the blade pierced his flesh. Blood spilled from the wound, but he didn't falter. Instead, it seemed to fuel his rage. He ripped the knife from his leg and tossed it aside, the muscles in his body tensing with fury. Rachel tried to crawl away again, her movements sluggish and weak. But the killer was on her in an instant, grabbing her ankle and dragging her back across the floor. Her nails clawed at the wooden boards, leaving bloody streaks behind as she was pulled toward him. With brutal force, the killer flipped her onto her back and straddled her, pinning her arms beneath his weight. The scissors hovered above her chest, and Rachel knew this was it. Her strength was gone, her body broken. All she could do was stare up at the masked face of her tormentor as he prepared to end her life. The killer's hand tightened around the scissors, his fingers curling into the handle as he raised the blades high. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat, her heart pounding in her ears. She closed her eyes, bracing for the final blow, but the sound of a loud crash shattered the silence. The cabin door flew open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. One of the surviving officers had followed the blood trail. His gun drawn, his eyes wide with shock as he took in the horrific scene before him. "Get away from her!" The officer shouted, leveling his gun at the killer. For the first time, the killer hesitated. He glanced over his shoulder, his mask betraying no emotion, but his body language shifting ever so slightly. Rachel took the opportunity, using what little energy she had left to throw a weak punch at the killer's face. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to throw him off balance. The officer fired, the sound of the gunshot echoing. Bullet slammed into the killer's shoulder, forcing him to stumble backward. He dropped the scissors, blood seeping through his torn shirt as he clutched the wound. Rachel rolled to the side, her body trembling as she tried to crawl toward the officer. Her vision swam, the pain in her side nearly unbearable. She felt her strength fading, her breaths becoming shallow and labored. But she couldn't stop now. She had to survive. The killer, however, wasn't finished. With a guttural snarl, he lunged at the officer, his hands outstretched. The two collided in a flurry of violence, the killer moving with terrifying speed despite his injuries. The officer tried to fire again, but the killer swatted the gun from his hands. Sending it skidding across the floor, they grappled for control, the officer landing a few solid blows, but the killer was relentless. He grabbed the officer by the throat, slamming him into the wall with brutal force. The officer gasped for air, his face turning red as the killer's grip tightened. Rachel watched in horror, unable to do anything but lie there as the killer strangled the life out of the only person who could save her. The officer's eyes bulged, his hands clawing at the killer's arm in a desperate attempt to break free, and then, with one swift motion, the killer twisted the officer's neck. The sickening snap echoed through the cabin as the officer's body went limp. His head lolling to the side, Rachel's heart sank. She was alone again. The killer let the officer's body drop to the ground, his breathing heavy as he turned his attention back to Rachel. Blood dripped from his shoulder, staining his clothes, but he didn't seem to care. He moved toward her slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. Rachel tried to crawl away, but her body refused to cooperate. She was too weak, too broken. All she could do was watch as the killer loomed over her, his shadow falling across her. She picked up the scissors from the floor, the blades still coated in her blood. With a slow, deliberate motion, he knelt beside her, his hand brushing a lock of blood-soaked hair from her face. For a brief moment, the killer paused, as if contemplating something, and then, with a cruel smile hidden beneath his mask, he raised the scissors and brought them down. The last thing Rachel felt was the cold bite of steel as the blades pierced her heart, and the world went black. The camp fell silent once more, the air thick with the scent of blood and death. The killer stood over Rachel's lifeless body, his hands still gripping the scissors buried in her chest. He stayed there for a moment, savoring the aftermath of his work, before finally standing and retreating into the shadows of the woods. As the sun set over the camp, the killer disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the echoes of his victims' screams and the blood-stained ground where their bodies lay. It was the 13th Friday, and the legend of the masked killer would continue to haunt those cursed woods for years to come. As Rachel's body lay motionless on the blood-soaked floor, the killer pulled the scissors from her chest with a slow, deliberate motion. The blades dripped with her blood, and the slick sound of the metal leaving her flesh seemed to echo throughout the cabin. He wiped the blades on her shirt, as if savoring every last drop of pain he had inflicted. His breath, slow and methodical, filled the quiet, broken only by the distant sound of rustling leaves outside the cabin walls. The night was far from over. Outside, the remaining survivors, unaware of the horrors inside, continued their mindless partying near the flickering bonfire. The laughter and drunken chatter filled the air, the music thumping loudly, drowning out any sense of danger that loomed just beyond the tree line. Travis, one of the group, was leaning back in his camping chair, taking another swig. Eyes were glazed, his senses dulled by the alcohol. "Dude, where the hell are Rachel and the others? They've been gone forever." "Probably screwing around in one of the cabins," Evan replied, lighting a cigarette. "You know how they are." Travis chuckled, but something gnawed at him. A nagging feeling, like an itch in the back of his mind. He glanced over toward the cabins, the shadows from the flickering fire casting long, distorted shapes across the ground. The place gave him the creeps, even after all the beer. "I don't know, man. I think I'm gonna go check on them." Evan rolled his eyes. "You're just looking for an excuse to walk in on something, you perv." Travis ignored him, stumbling to his feet. He grabbed a flashlight from his backpack and started toward the cabins. The beam of light cut through the thick darkness, illuminating the path just enough to keep him from tripping over the uneven ground. The party sounds faded behind him as he ventured deeper into the shadowy woods. Inside the cabin, the killer stood still for a moment, listening. The faint sound of footsteps crunching on the dirt outside grew louder, and he knew someone else was coming. He moved swiftly, his footsteps silent as he slipped out of the cabin, disappearing into the thick trees surrounding the camp. Travis reached the cabin and pushed the door open, his flashlight flickering as it illuminated the gruesome scene inside. His stomach dropped. Rachel's body lay crumpled on the floor, her lifeless eyes staring up at him, her chest a gaping wound. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, pooling beneath her, soaking into the wooden floorboards. "Fuck." Travis stammered, backing up into the doorframe, the bile rising in his throat. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling uncontrollably, but in his panic, it slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. He crouched down, grabbing the phone with shaking hands, his breathing ragged and uneven. Rachel. Oh God, make sense of what he was seeing. Something moved in the shadows behind him. Travis turned, shining his flashlight toward the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. The beam caught a glimpse of something, a figure standing just beyond the trees. A figure wearing a blood-streaked mask. "Who the fuck are you?" Travis shouted, stumbling backward into the cabin. The killer stepped forward, into the light, the glint of steel in his hand catching Travis' eye. The scissors, dripping with fresh blood. Travis didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted out of the cabin, sprinting toward the bonfire as fast as his legs would carry him. His mind raced, his vision blurred by tears and fear. He had to warn the others, he had to get out of here, but the killer was fast. Too fast. In a blink, the masked figure was on him, grabbing Travis by the back of his neck and yanking him off his feet with terrifying strength. Travis hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He gasped for air, clawing at the dirt, trying to scramble away, but the killer wasn't going to let him go so easily. The scissors plunged into Travis' leg, severing muscle and tendons with a sickening crunch. He screamed, a raw, agonized sound that echoed through the trees. Blood poured from the wound as the killer twisted the blades, sending waves of unbearable pain ripping through Travis' body. "Please no," Travis begged, his voice hoarse and broken, tears streaming down his face. The killer didn't respond. He pulled the scissors free with a sharp yank, then stabbed them into Travis' side, just below his ribs. Another scream tore from Travis' throat as the metal sliced through his flesh. The killer worked with precision, dragging the blades upward, creating a jagged, gory line that left Travis writhing in pain. Evan, hearing the distant screams, finally stood from his spot by the fire. He looked around, noticing that Travis hadn't returned. "Yo," others, who were now starting to glance nervously toward the woods, sounded like screaming. One of the girls said, her voice shaky. Evan grabbed a flashlight, the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. "Stay here. I'm gonna check it out." As Evan ventured into the dark woods, the sounds of laughter and music faded behind him. He felt a chill in the air, a tension that seemed to grip the night. His flashlight beam wavered as he moved, scanning the trees and the shadows for any sign of his friends. That's when he found Travis, lying face down in the dirt, his body a mutilated mess of blood and torn flesh. The scissors were still embedded in his back, twisted into the base of his spine. Evan's breath hitched in his throat, the sight of his friend's mutilated body sending a surge of terror coursing through him. "Fuck Travis, no." Evan's voice cracked as he stumbled backward, panic setting in. Before he could turn and run, he felt something cold and sharp brush against the back of his neck. The killer was right behind him. With brutal speed, the killer grabbed Evan by the hair and slammed him face first into a nearby tree. The impact shattered Evan's nose, blood spraying from his face as he let out a pained cry. Dazed and disoriented, he barely had time to react before the killer's hands were on him again, pulling him backward and throwing him to the ground. Evan tried to fight, kicking and swinging blindly, but the killer was relentless. He straddled Evan, pinning him down with one knee. In one swift motion, the killer retrieved the blood-soaked scissors from Travis' corpse, raising them high above his head. Evan's eyes widened, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the blades descended. The scissors pierced his throat with a wet, crunching sound. Blood sprayed from the wound, gurgling in Evan's throat as he choked on his own blood. The killer twisted the scissors, tearing through flesh and bone with convulsed beneath him, his hands weakly grasping at the air as the life drained from his eyes. When it was over, the killer stood, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. He wiped the scissors clean on Evan's shirt, then turned toward the distant glow of the bonfire, where the remaining survivors still had no idea that death was coming for them next. Back at the campfire, the remaining group was growing restless. The laughter had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. They exchanged worried glances, their minds beginning to piece together the terrifying possibility that something was very wrong. "What's taking them so long?" one of the girls asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but I don't like this," another guy replied, standing up and looking toward the woods. "We need to get the hell out of here." Before they could decide on what to do, the killer emerged from the trees, his masked face illuminated by the firelight. His clothes were drenched in blood, and the scissors in his hand glinted menacingly. The group froze, the realization of what was happening sinking in too late. In a flash, the killer was on them. The first victim barely had time to scream before the scissors sliced through his stomach, spilling his guts onto the ground. Blood sprayed across the fire as the killer moved with ruthless efficiency, cutting down the next person with a savage stab to the throat. The remaining survivors scattered in all directions, their terrified screams filling the night. But there was no escape. The killer was relentless. The survivors had scattered, but panic made their attempts at escape futile. The masked killer moved through the woods with chilling precision, tracking them down like prey. The quiet woods were now filled with echoes of distant screams and the crunch of leaves beneath boots, but no one could see him coming until it was too late. The air reeked of blood, and the fog that rolled in only added to the suffocating terror that clung to every survivor's mind. Carly had sprinted blindly into the woods, heart pounding in her chest. Her lungs burned, and tears streamed down her face as she gasped for air. She tripped over an exposed root, falling hard on her knees. Wincing in pain, she looked over her shoulder, expecting to see the masked figure behind her. But there was nothing, only the dark trees and the thickening fog. She tried to stand but stumbled again, her legs weakened by the trauma. "Come on, come on," she whispered to herself, biting back a sob. Her hands trembled as she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone to call for help. But the screen was cracked, useless. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was completely alone out here. As she attempted to rise again, a hand clamped down on her shoulder from behind. Carly screamed, spinning around, but the killer was already there, towering over her. His mask gleamed in the faint moonlight, and the bloody scissors glinted in his hand. Her body froze in terror, the cold metal of the scissor blades just inches from her throat. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the killer tilted his head slowly, as if savoring the fear in her eyes. "No, please. Don't," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. The killer didn't hesitate. He slashed at her chest, cutting deep into her skin with brutal precision. Carly's scream echoed through the woods as she fell backward, clutching at the wound as blood poured from the gaping cut. The killer, before plunging the scissors into her thigh, twisting them cruelly. Carly's cries grew weaker as the pain overwhelmed her. The killer, emotionless and relentless, began carving deeper, slowly and methodically, as if enjoying the torment he inflicted. Her voice faded to a gurgling whimper, her body twitching as she slipped into unconsciousness. Meanwhile, back at the bonfire site, only Jake and Lauren remained, crouching low, hidden in the bushes, watching the gruesome massacre unfold. The distant sounds of their friends' dying screams filled the air, and they knew they were next. Jake's hands were shaking as he gripped a large rock, his face pale. "We have to do something," Lauren whispered, tears streaking her face. Jake shook his head, his voice trembling. "We can't fight him. You saw what he did to the others. He'll kill us too." Lauren clenched her fists, her heart racing. She wasn't ready to give up. "Then we run. We get back to the car and get the hell out of here. It's our only chance." Jake nodded, swallowing hard. Okay. On 3. They both took a deep breath, and Jake started counting. 1. 2. Before he could finish, the killer emerged from the fog, standing directly in front of them. His blood-soaked mask stared down at them, and the blades of his scissors dripped with crimson. Time seemed to freeze as they locked eyes with the masked figure. His presence was so chilling, so inhuman, that it drained all hope from their hearts. Jake reacted first, swinging the rock wildly at the killer. But the killer sidestepped effortlessly and, with a swift motion, slashed Jake across the arm. Jake dropped the rock, clutching his wound, blood spilling through his fingers. He staggered back, screaming in pain. Lauren turned to run, but the killer grabbed a handful of her hair, yanking her back with terrifying strength. She hit the ground hard, her foot. She kicked wildly, but the killer pinned her down with his boot, his heavy weight crushing her into the ground. Jake, bleeding and desperate, lunged at the killer again, this time with a makeshift spear he'd grabbed from the firewood pile. He thrust it toward the killer's torso, aiming for his heart. But the killer was faster. He blocked the attack and, with one brutal swipe of the scissors, severed Jake's arm from his body. Jake screamed in agony, collapsing to his knees as blood sprayed from the stump where his arm had been. The killer stood over him, watching as Jake writhed in pain, before plunging the scissors into his back, severing his spine with a sickening crack. Jake's body went limp instantly, his dying breath escaping in a low, ragged wheeze. Lauren, seeing Jake's lifeless body crumple to the ground, felt pure terror surge through her. She knew she was next. But something inside her snapped. The fear turned to fury, and in one desperate move, she grabbed a burning log from the campfire, swinging it toward the killer's mask. The firelight flared as the log connected, flames licking at the killer's face. He recoiled, stumbling back, momentarily blinded by the heat and light. Lauren didn't waste the chance. She scrambled to her feet, running as fast as she could toward the parking lot where the car waited. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her entire body screaming for her to stop, but she pushed forward, her survival instinct stronger than ever. The car was in sight. She reached into her pocket for the keys, but her hands were trembling too much to grasp them. She fumbled, dropping the keys in the dirt. No, no, no. She cried, frantically searching the ground as she heard the killer's heavy footsteps approaching behind her. Finally, she found the keys, her fingers closing around them just as the killer's shadow loomed over her. She jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. Law roared to life, but before she could shift into drive, the windshield shattered. The killer's scissors pierced through the glass, inches from her face. Lauren screamed, throwing the car into reverse. The tires screeched as the car flew backward, the killer clinging to the hood, stabbing wildly at the glass. She slammed on the brakes, sending him flying off the car and into the dirt. Without hesitation, Lauren hit the gas, speeding forward as fast as the car would go. The killer rose to his feet, staring after her, but he didn't give chase. He simply stood there, watching as she disappeared down the road, his mask gleaming in the moonlight, blood dripping from his weapon. Lauren didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town. Her hands were still shaking, her face streaked with tears. She was the last one standing, the only one who made it out alive, but as she looked into the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her blood-splattered face, she knew that the nightmare wasn't over. That masked figure, the man who had butchered her friends, was still out there, waiting for the next 13th Friday. The killer stood in the woods, the camp behind him now silent, stained with the blood of the reckless souls who had dared to trespass. He reached up, adjusting his mask, his breathing slow and steady. The night was calm once more, the wind carrying away the last echoes of screams. He walked toward the cabin, back to the shadows where he would wait for the next foolish group to return. There was always another group. Another night of blood, and when the time came, he would be ready. The blood-soaked scissors gleamed as he disappeared into the trees, leaving nothing behind but death and the promise of terror to come.